A single mother lived next door for 10 years. My son could not stand her. He even hired a crew to build an ugly 8-foot fence between our properties, claiming she was a dangerous addict who needed to be shut out of our lives. When she passed away, suddenly I was the only person from our street who showed up to her funeral. A man in a gray suit approached me by her grave and handed me a thick letter. What I read inside that letter did not just shatter the lies my son had been telling me. It handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy the prison he had built around me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly gather your strength while someone underestimated your worth. I am James, 71 years old, and for the last 2 years I have been a ghost haunting my own home. I built this 4-bedroom colonial house with my own hands and the wages I earned from 40 years at the manufacturing plant. It was meant to be my sanctuary, the place where I would comfortably spend my twilight years after my wife passed away. But that dream was hijacked by my own flesh and blood. My son Colin and his wife Megan moved in under the guise of taking care of me. Within 6 months, they had completely taken over the master suite, pushing me into the cramped, drafty guest room at the back of the hallway. The walls of that room were painted a sterile hospital white, completely devoid of the warmth I had cultivated throughout the rest of the house. I watched silently as Megan boxed up my late wife's antique vases and family photographs, replacing them with cold, modern art and expensive, soulless furniture. Their invasion was not just physical, it was financial. Colin had cornered me one Sunday morning with a stack of legal documents and a look of manufactured concern. He claimed my memory was slipping, pointing to a utility bill I had supposedly forgotten to pay, though I distinctly remembered placing the check in the mail. He used that manufactured crisis to convince me to sign a financial management agreement, giving him complete control over my retirement accounts and pension. He assured me it was just a precaution, a way to lift the burden of managing money off my tired shoulders. I signed the papers because I loved him, and because I was exhausted from the constant, subtle arguments. But the moment the ink dried, the dynamic shifted permanently. I was no longer the patriarch of the house. I was an inconvenience, a stubborn stain they could not quite wash out. Megan made sure I felt that reality every single day. She would sigh loudly whenever I entered the kitchen to make a cup of tea, rolling her eyes, as if my mere presence was exhausting her. She complained constantly, to Colin loud enough for me to hear through the thin drywall of the guest room, that I was a burden, a heavy anchor dragging down their new life. She would throw away my perfectly good leftovers, claiming they were expired, forcing me to ask Colin-san for small amounts of cash just to buy my own groceries. They were systematically stripping away my autonomy piece by piece, hoping I would simply fade into the background and wait for the end. But behind my silence, my mind was perfectly sharp. I absorbed every insult, every condescending remark, and every stolen dollar, storing them away in the quiet vault of my memory. The only solace I had left was my garden in the backyard. It was a beautiful sunlit patch where I grew prize-winning heirloom tomatoes and vibrant blue hydrangeas. My neighbor Rachel often stood by the low chain-link fence that separated our yards, offering a warm smile and a compliment about my flowers. Rachel was a quiet, hard-working single mother who lived with her teenage daughter, Lily. They kept to themselves, maintaining a neat home and a peaceful life. But for some reason, Colin possessed an irrational, burning hatred for her. He would stand at the kitchen window, his jaw clenched, glaring at Rachel as she watered her lawn. He began feeding me outrageous stories. He claimed Rachel was unhinged, deeply involved in illegal narcotics, and a physical danger to our neighborhood. He told me he had seen strange men prowling around her property and warned me never to speak to her again. I knew Rachel. I knew she was a decent woman. But Colin escalated his imaginary war. One Tuesday morning, I awoke to the deafening roar of heavy machinery. I rushed out to the backyard to find a crew of aggressive contractors tearing up the property line. Without consulting me, without even pulling a proper city permit, Colin had hired them to construct a massive, ugly, 8-foot-tall, solid wood privacy fence directly along the border of Rachel S. yard. The construction was brutal and fast. The workers trampled my beloved hydrangeas and crushed my tomato vines under their heavy boots. When I demanded to know what was happening, Colin stepped in front of me, his chest puffed out aggressively, stating that he was protecting his family from the drug addict next door. The fence went up in 2 days. It was a towering, oppressive wall of dark-stained wood that completely blocked the morning sunlight from reaching my garden. My plants withered and died within weeks, leaving my backyard looking like a barren prison yard. The fence cast a permanent cold shadow over my guest room window, a daily reminder of my son's absolute control over my environment. The psychological isolation tightened its grip. Whenever I tried to go out to the front yard to check the mail, hoping to catch a glimpse of Rachel and apologize for the monstrous wall, Colin would suddenly appear. He would physically intercept me, placing a heavy restraining hand on my shoulder, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper as he warned me to stay away from the fence and the crazy woman on the other side. He treated me like a disobedient child, physically corralling me back into the house. Simultaneously, the gaslighting reached a terrifying new level. I began noticing that my mail was vanishing. Letters from my old friends, bank statements I desperately wanted to review, and even my medical insurance updates simply stopped arriving. When I asked Megan about it, she gave me a patronizing smile, patting my arm as if I were a confused toddler. She claimed I was just misplacing things casually, suggesting that my mind was deteriorating faster than they feared. Then my car keys disappeared. My reliable old sedan sat in the driveway, completely inaccessible to me. Megan swore she had seen me leave them at the grocery store, a place I had not been to in weeks. They were trapping me inside the house, cutting off my ability to communicate with the outside world, or leave on my own terms. As my world shrank to the confines of my shadowy guest room, I began to notice a bizarre pattern of activity at night. Colin had recently spent a massive amount of money to expand our attached 2-car garage into a sprawling, insulated fortress with frosted windows and heavy steel doors. He claimed he needed the space for his new contracting business. But a legitimate contractor does not conduct business at 2 a.m. I would lie awake in the dark, listening to the crunch of gravel as unfamiliar high-end luxury vehicles pulled into our driveway long past midnight. Sleek, matte black sports cars and heavy armored-looking SUVs would glide silently up to the new garage. I could hear the heavy steel doors roll up, swallowing the vehicles before violently slamming shut. Muffled voices, harsh laughter, and the distinct sound of industrial tools echoed through the walls until dawn. I knew with absolute certainty that whatever Colin was doing in that garage, it was entirely illegal, and the massive 8-foot fence was not built to keep Rachel out. It was built to keep her from seeing in. The tension finally snapped on a humid Thursday afternoon. Colin and Megan had gone into town, leaving me alone in the house. I walked out to the backyard, standing mournfully beside the dead remnants of my garden. Suddenly, I heard a soft scratching sound coming from the other side of the monstrous wooden wall. I stepped closer, pressing my ear against the rough timber. I heard Rachel S.'s voice, low and urgent, whispering my name. I found a small gap between the wooden slats and peered through. Rachel looked terrified. Her eyes were darting around nervously, and she was clutching a thick manila envelope to her chest. She pushed the corner of the envelope through the narrow gap, desperately whispering that I needed to take it, that I needed to read what was inside before Colin destroyed everything I owned. I reached my hand out, my trembling fingers grazing the heavy paper. But before I could grasp it, the back door of my house violently flew open. Colin stormed out onto the patio, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He had returned early. He sprinted across the dead grass, shoving me aside with such force that I stumbled and fell to my knees. He grabbed the corner of the envelope protruding through the fence and yanked it savagely. He screamed at the wooden wall, threatening to call the police on Rachel, threatening to have her arrested for trespassing and harassment. He crumpled the thick envelope in his massive fists and threw it directly into a deep puddle of muddy water near the patio drainage. He stood over me, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and dark. He pointed a finger directly at my face, warning me that if he ever caught me communicating with that woman again, he would put me in a state-run nursing home so fast my head would spin. He marched back into the house, leaving me kneeling in the dirt. I stayed there silent, my heart pounding a furious rhythm against my ribs. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I simply waited. I waited for hours until the sun went down and the house grew completely quiet. I waited until I heard the heavy rhythmic snoring coming from the master suite. Then I slowly opened the back door and crept out into the cold night air. My joints ached, but my mind was laser-focused. I crawled through the wet grass until I reached the mud puddle. The envelope was completely ruined. The muddy water had soaked through the manila paper, turning the documents inside into an unrecognizable mushy pulp of smeared ink and ruined paper. My heart sank as I sifted through the destruction, but as I carefully pulled apart the wet layers, I found a single small scrap of heavy cardstock that had survived the moisture. It was the corner of a business card. The ink was slightly blurred, but I could clearly read the elegant black letters printed across the top. It read, "Oliver Pierce, Attorney at Law." I wiped the mud from the card, folded it carefully, and slid it deep into the pocket of my robe. I did not know what Rachel had been trying to tell me, but I knew who held the answers. The simmering anger I had swallowed for 2 years finally crystallized into a cold, unbreakable resolve. The silent adjustment had begun. The flashing red and blue lights pierced through the thin curtains of my guest room window. It was shortly after 2 in the morning when the harsh mechanical wail of sirens shattered the quiet suburban night. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs, and rushed to the window. Because of the massive wooden wall my son had built, I could not see the street directly, but the frantic strobe of emergency lights painted the top of the fence in terrifying, erratic colors. I quickly pulled on my thick woolen robe and hurried quietly out the front door, stepping onto the cold concrete of our driveway. Next door, the scene was a chaotic blur of desperate movement. 2 ambulances and a police cruiser were parked haphazardly on Rachel's front lawn. The heavy wooden fence blocked my view of her porch, so I walked all the way down to the sidewalk to see past the barrier. Paramedics were rushing a stretcher out the front door. On the stretcher lay Rachel. Even from a distance, the pale, lifeless tone of her skin beneath the harsh streetlights told me everything I needed to know. One of the paramedics was frantically performing chest compressions, his movements sharp and violently rhythmic, but there was an awful heavy stillness to her body that no medical effort could erase. Standing by the front steps, illuminated by the flashing lights, was Lily. Rachel's teenage daughter was clutching a thin gray blanket around her shoulders, her face buried in the chest of a female police officer. Lily was not screaming. She was shaking with a silent, consuming grief that felt like a physical weight pressing down on the entire street. I wanted to cross the grass. I wanted to hold that poor girl and tell her I was sorry, to offer some useless measure of comfort. But my feet remained planted on the cold pavement. I knew that if Colin woke up and saw me out there, he would create a scene that would only add to Lily's trauma. I stood in the shadows, a silent witness to a devastating tragedy. A few moments later, the paramedics stopped their frantic efforts. The lead medic shook his head slowly, and they pulled a white sheet over Rachel's face. The ambulance did not turn its sirens back on when it finally drove away. It rolled silently down the street, carrying away a good woman who had lived quietly and bothered no one. I would learn later from the whispers in the neighborhood that Rachel had suffered a massive, catastrophic heart attack. The doctors said it was entirely stress-induced. My mind immediately flashed back to the sheer terror in her eyes when she had tried to hand me that manila envelope through the fence just days before. The stress that killed her was not a medical anomaly. It was manufactured by the men working in my son's garage. I walked back into my house feeling a profound, heavy sorrow settling into my bones. The house was dark and quiet. I assumed Colin and Megan had slept through the commotion, cocooned in the luxurious comfort of the master suite. I slowly made my way toward the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water, needing something to soothe my dry throat. As I reached the end of the hallway, a sudden loud pop echoed through the house, followed by the distinct sound of fizzing liquid and a burst of triumphant laughter. I stepped quietly into the shadow of the doorway and looked into the brightly lit kitchen. Colin and Megan were standing by the marble island. They were not wearing the sleepy, confused expressions of people who had just been woken by emergency vehicles. Colin was fully dressed in dark jeans and a black sweater, holding a thick green bottle of expensive champagne. The cork rested on the counter next to two crystal-fluted glasses. Megan was wearing a silk robe, a wide, predatory smile stretching across her face as Colin poured the bubbling golden liquid. My stomach twisted into a tight, agonizing knot. A woman they had lived next to for years was lying dead on a metal table, and her teenage daughter was currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser, entirely alone in the world. And my son was opening a bottle of vintage champagne. Colin raised his glass, the crystal catching the bright kitchen lights. He looked at his wife and spoke in a voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. He said, "The witch is dead." He took a long sip of his drink and slammed the glass down on the marble counter. He laughed, a harsh grating sound that made my skin crawl. He told Megan that this was the best thing that could have possibly happened for their business. With Rachel gone, he explained the property next door would inevitably go into foreclosure or be tied up in a messy, prolonged probate process. Lily was underage and had no other family, meaning the house would sit completely empty for months, perhaps even years. Megan giggled, wrapping her arms around Colin's waist. She asked him what that meant for the new garage expansion. Colin smiled, revealing a terrifying, unhinged greed. He said it meant they no longer had to worry about property lines. He explicitly stated that he was going to hire the paving crew first thing next week. He planned to tear down a section of the 8-foot fence and pave the new driveway expansion directly over Rachel's property line. He claimed no one would be there to notice, no one would be there to complain, and by the time the bank ever got around to surveying the land, the concrete would be fully cured, and the massive new delivery trucks could easily access the back of the garage. They were toasting to theft. They were celebrating the sudden tragic death of a mother because it gave them a few extra feet of dirt to run their illegal operation. A wave of pure, concentrated disgust washed over me. It was so intense it almost made me physically ill. I wanted to step into the light, slap the crystal glass out of his arrogant hand, and scream at him for the monster he had become. I wanted to demand to know what he was really hiding behind those steel garage doors that made him so desperate for space, but I did not move. The motif of my survival had become absolute silence. If I confronted them now, I would simply be an emotional old man throwing a tantrum. I would tip my hand and show them that I was paying close attention. Instead, I forced my facial muscles to relax. I let my shoulders slump forward perfectly, adopting the posture of a tired, slightly confused elderly man who had simply wandered out of bed for a glass of water. I intentionally shuffled my bare feet against the hardwood floor to announce my presence. Colin and Megan instantly stopped laughing. Colin quickly stepped in front of the champagne bottle, his face shifting into a mask of fake annoyance. I blinked slowly at the bright kitchen lights, pretending to be disoriented by the glare. I asked them in a weak and raspy voice what all the noise was about, claiming the lights outside had woken me up. Colin looked at me with deep contempt. He dismissed me entirely, waving his hand toward the hallway. He told me it was nothing, just a medical emergency next door, and instructed me to go back to sleep. He spoke to me as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into the house. I nodded slowly, playing my part to perfection. I turned my back on them and walked away, leaning heavily on the wall for support. But as I retreated to my dark, cold guest room, my sorrow completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, hardened steel. They thought they had won. They thought the obstacle was removed. They had no idea that they had just given me the ultimate motivation to tear their entire world down to the foundation. The sun had barely risen when the heavy thud of sledgehammers echoed through the walls of my guest room. It had been less than 12 hours since the coroner carried Rachel away. I stood by my window and looked out into the backyard. Colin was already awake and giving orders to a small crew of rough-looking men. They were standing at the far corner of the massive 8-foot wooden fence. With a series of violent swings, they began smashing the heavy timber. The wood splintered and cracked as they tore down a wide section of the barrier my son had just paid to build. I watched in quiet horror as Colin grabbed a bundle of wooden stakes and a spool of bright orange string. He walked straight through the newly created gap and stepped onto Rachel's property. He did not hesitate. He marched a full 15 feet into her yard, driving the wooden stakes deep into her manicured lawn with a heavy mallet. He was marking the boundaries for his new concrete driveway. He was actively stealing her land, while her body was barely cold. The sheer audacity of his greed was breathtaking. He laughed with the workman pointing toward his oversized garage, and then toward the street, mapping out exactly how the heavy delivery trucks would soon cut across the dead neighbor's property. As the deafening sound of a rented backhoe started up, tearing into the soft earth of Rachel's garden, another tragedy was unfolding out front. I walked to the living room window and peered through the curtains. A plain white state vehicle was parked against the curb. 2 women holding clipboards walked up Rachel's front steps. A few moments later, the front door opened. Lily stepped out into the morning light. The teenage girl was wearing the same clothes she had worn the night before. She was carrying a single faded canvas duffel bag that seemed to hold her entire life. Her head hung low and her shoulders shook with a silent, agonizing weeping. I looked back toward the side yard. Colin had stopped working for a moment to drink from a water bottle. He leaned against the remaining section of the fence and watched Lily being escorted down the driveway. He did not lower his head. He did not offer a moment of silence. He simply wiped his mouth, smirked, and yelled at the backhoe operator to dig deeper. He watched a grieving orphan being swallowed by the foster care system and smiled because it meant his real estate theft would go completely unchallenged. The coldness in his eyes was absolute. It was the look of a man who believed he was completely untouchable. I stepped away from the window, my chest heavy with a profound sorrow for the girl, but my mind was completely clear. 3 days passed. The tearing of the earth next door continued relentlessly. On the morning of Rachel's funeral, I woke up early. I opened the small, narrow closet in my guest room and pulled out my only black suit. It was the same suit I had worn to my own wife's funeral a decade ago. It smelled faintly of cedar and old memories. I spent 20 minutes carefully brushing the fabric, ensuring there was not a single speck of dust on the lapels. I tied my dark tie with slow, deliberate movements. I was preparing myself not just to mourn a good woman, but to stand as the solitary witness to her existence. I walked down the hallway and stepped into the living room. Colin was sprawled across the expensive leather sofa. He was wearing stained sweatpants and a tight athletic shirt, deeply engrossed in a loud television program. Empty coffee mugs and crumpled food wrappers littered the glass coffee table in front of him. He heard my footsteps and slowly turned his head. He looked me up and down, his eyes scanning my polished shoes and my crisp white shirt. A cruel barking laugh erupted from his chest. He muted the television and sat up, pointing a finger at me. He asked me if I was going to a job interview at a funeral parlor. He mocked the cut of my jacket, telling me I looked like a forgotten relic from a black and white movie. I stood perfectly still, letting his insults wash over me without reacting. I calmly stated that I was going to Rachel's funeral to pay my respects. Colin rolled his eyes and threw his head back against the sofa cushions. He told me I was wasting my time. He called Rachel a worthless addict who got exactly what she deserved. He explicitly forbade me from taking his car, claiming he needed it later, even though the keys to my own vehicle were still hidden away in Megan's purse. He told me to have fun standing in the dirt with a bunch of junkies and turned the volume on the television back up, dismissing me entirely. He expected me to argue. He expected me to beg for a ride or defend Rachel's honor. I did neither. I simply turned around and walked out the front door. The cemetery was 4 miles away, and I did not have a car. I walked to the end of the street and waited for the city bus. The sky was overcast, casting a pale gray light over the neighborhood, perfectly matching the heavy silence in my heart. Every step I took away from that house was a step toward a terrible justice. Colin believed his disrespect was a display of dominance. He did not realize that every cruel word he spoke and every inch of ground he stole was just another nail in the coffin he was building for himself. I boarded the bus and took a seat near the window, my face an unreadable mask, ready to bury a friend and completely unearth the truth. The city bus dropped me off a half-mile from the cemetery gates. I walked the rest of the way beneath a long canopy of ancient weeping willows that seemed to mirror the heavy sorrow settling deep in my chest. The morning air was sharp and bit through the thin fabric of my black suit, but I kept my pace steady. Oakwood Cemetery was a sprawling labyrinth of marble monuments and towering stone obelisks, a place holding the city's wealthy and forgotten alike. I followed the small temporary metal signs pointing toward the newer and much less expensive plots located at the very edge of the grounds, right up against a rusted iron perimeter fence. As I crested a small grassy hill, I finally saw the green canvas canopy set up over the freshly dug earth. I had expected to see a small, modest gathering. Rachel had lived in our neighborhood for 10 long years. She was a quiet woman, but she was always kind and polite. I expected to see at least a few familiar faces, perhaps the friendly cashier from the local grocery store where she shopped, or a teacher from her daughter's high school. But as I drew closer, a cold, suffocating knot formed in my stomach. The 2 rows of folding chairs set up on the artificial green grass were completely empty. There were no elegant floral arrangements resting on metal stands. There was no pastor or priest standing at the head of the grave holding a worn leather Bible. There was only a simple, polished oak casket resting on a cold metal lowering device looking terribly small against the vast gray expanse of the cemetery. The profound emptiness of the scene hit me like a physical blow. It was a brutal, silent testament to the extreme isolation Colin had forced upon her. My son had painted her as a dangerous pariah spreading toxic rumors until even the decent neighbors who knew better decided it was simply easier to stay away and avoid his wrath. I felt a burning surge of shame for my community and a deeply localized hatred for my own flesh and blood who had orchestrated this complete social exile. I walked slowly down the slope, the damp morning grass soaking the bottom of my polished dress shoes, until I stood just a few feet away from the edge of the canopy. It was then that I noticed her. Sitting in the very front row, perched on the edge of a cold metal chair, was Lily. She was wearing a simple dark dress that looked a full size too big for her thin, trembling frame. Her posture was completely defeated. She was hunched over her elbows, resting heavily on her knees, her face buried entirely in her pale hands. She was not making a single sound. There were no loud, dramatic sobs, just the continuous, agonizing shaking of her narrow shoulders. She had been brought here by a state-appointed social worker who stood a respectful distance away near a parked sedan, constantly checking her phone, treating the burial of a young mother like a routine administrative appointment. Looking at Lily, I saw the ultimate victim of my son's unchecked, monstrous ambition. Colin did not just steal a few feet of dirt to pour concrete. He actively helped destroy the foundation of this young girl's entire world. I took a step forward, desperately wanting to place a comforting hand on her shoulder, to tell her that her mother was a good, honorable woman, and that she was not forgotten. But before I could close the short distance between us, another distinct figure caught my attention. Standing on the exact opposite side of the casket, partially obscured by the dark shadow of the green canvas canopy, was a man I had never seen before. He was tall, with sharp, aristocratic features, and dark hair just beginning to turn silver at the temples. He was wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit that stood out starkly against the bleak, muddy surroundings. He held a long black umbrella with both hands, the tip resting firmly on the damp earth, though the sky was only threatening rain. He was not looking at the polished wood of the casket. He was looking directly at me. His gaze was intense, deeply analytical, and remarkably calm. He did not possess the fragile demeanor of a grieving relative or a sad friend. He radiated the sharp, focused energy of a man on a very specific mission. I stopped in my tracks, meeting his steady gaze across the open grave. We stood there in absolute silence for a long moment, the only sound, the rustling of the dry willow branches in the cold wind. Then the man slowly let go of his umbrella, letting it lean carefully against an empty folding chair. He walked around the head of the casket, stepping onto the artificial turf, and moved directly toward me. His footsteps were entirely silent. As he stopped just 2 feet in front of me, I could see the faint lines of exhaustion etched around his dark eyes, but his posture remained rigid with purpose. He reached into the inside breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and slowly withdrew a thick, heavy envelope sealed with dark red wax. He held it out toward me, but he did not release his grip immediately. He asked in a low, smooth voice if my name was James. I simply nodded, my throat suddenly too tight and dry to speak. He looked down at the heavy envelope, then back up at my face, studying my reaction. He said his name was Oliver Pierce. He stated clearly that he was Rachel's attorney. At the exact sound of that name, my breath caught painfully in my chest. Oliver Pierce. It was the exact name printed on the muddy, ruined scrap of cardstock, currently burning a hole in the inner pocket of my winter overcoat. The universe had just violently snapped into focus. He lowered his voice further, speaking just above a raspy whisper, so the social worker near the car could not hear our conversation. He told me that Rachel had given him very specific, unalterable instructions before her heart gave out. He said she knew her time was rapidly running out, that the relentless stress of the situation next door was physically killing her, and that she knew exactly who was responsible for the nightmare. He finally let go of the thick envelope, leaving its substantial weight resting in my trembling hands. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that Rachel said if anything ever happened to her, I was the only person in the entire world who possessed the power to stop my son. The cold wind whipped around us, but the fire inside my chest roared to life. The funeral was empty, but the war had just officially begun. Oliver stood motionless as the damp cemetery wind tugged at his heavy charcoal coat. He extended the thick envelope toward me. Its deep red wax seal bore the formal pressed emblem of his law firm. He spoke with a quiet intensity that cut cleanly through the bleak graveyard air. He said Rachel told him that if anything ever happened to her, I was the only person in the entire world who possessed the power to stop my son. I reached out and took the envelope. Its physical weight felt immense in my hands. Oliver did not offer any hollow apologies or empty condolences. He simply gave me a firm nod, turned around, and walked slowly back toward his parked vehicle, leaving me entirely alone with the truth. I did not open the envelope there in the cold, open air. I carefully placed it inside my coat and took the long bus ride back to my neighborhood. When I unlocked the front door, the house was completely empty. Colin and Megan were gone, likely out celebrating their perceived victory and planning the destruction of Rachel's garden. The silence of the house felt entirely different now. It no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a stage waiting for the final act. I walked straight to my small desk in the guest room, turned on the single brass reading lamp, and broke the heavy red wax seal. Inside was a thick stack of printed documents, a small black digital drive, and a single handwritten letter resting on top. The handwriting was neat and precise, perfectly matching the quiet woman who had lived next door. The very first paragraph completely dismantled the toxic narrative my son had spent months building. Rachel wrote that she knew exactly what Colin had been telling me. She knew he called her a dangerous drug addict and an unhinged woman who needed to be kept away. But Rachel was none of those things. She was a senior forensic accountant for the State Department of Revenue. Her entire career was dedicated to tracking invisible money, auditing corrupt corporations, and finding the hidden threads of massive financial abuse. She had moved to our quiet suburban street a decade ago, specifically for the profound peace it offered away from her grueling high-stakes work. But a few months ago, her work had violently followed her home. She wrote that she first became suspicious when Colin started his sudden late-night home renovations. The types of luxury vehicles arriving in our driveway at 3 in the morning did not belong to standard construction contractors. They belonged to men she had personally investigated before. Rachel quietly ran the license plates and pulled the public tax records for Colin's new business. What she found was a massive and highly sophisticated criminal operation. Colin's contracting firm was nothing but a hollow shell company. He was not building houses or paving roads. He was laundering millions of dollars stolen directly from the retirement funds of vulnerable elderly clients across the state. Rachel explained that she had been gathering evidence for federal authorities for weeks. She had set up a high-definition camera in her upstairs bedroom window to record the nightly license plates and capture the faces of the men delivering the stolen cash to the garage. But Colin had noticed the faint reflection of the camera lens one night. That was the real reason he suddenly hired a crew to build the massive 8-foot wooden fence. It had absolutely nothing to do with protecting our privacy or keeping a dangerous neighbor away. The towering wall was constructed entirely to block her line of sight, to permanently blind the only person who knew exactly what he was doing in the dark. My hands began to shake violently as I read the next page. It was not just a profound anger for what he had done to those poor strangers. It was a deep, freezing terror for what he had done to me. Rachel wrote that she dug much deeper into the initial capital Colin used to start his shell company. Criminal enterprises require massive seed money, a large initial cash investment, to bribe officials, secure the armored garage, and establish fake offshore accounts. Colin needed a staggering amount of cash very quickly, and he found it right under his own roof. Attached to Rachel's handwritten letter was a printed copy of a verified bank document. I stared at the page, my vision blurring at the edges as the reality set in. It was a commercial loan agreement for a second mortgage on my home. The amount was absolutely staggering. $2.5 million. I looked at the bottom of the page where the signature line rested. There, written in blue ink, was my name, but I had never signed that paper. Colin had expertly forged my signature. He had used the deceptive financial management agreement I signed months ago to completely bypass the bank's security protocols and authorize the massive loan. He had taken all the equity I had built over 40 years of hard physical labor and gambled it entirely on a massive federal crime. The full, devastating picture finally became clear. If his operation was ever discovered, or if the federal authorities raided that garage, the shell company would instantly collapse. The bank would immediately demand the repayment of the $2.5 million loan. Because the massive mortgage was fraudulently attached to my name and my property, the bank would seize my house. I would be thrown into the street entirely penniless, homeless, and legally ruined. Colin had not just stolen my master bedroom or hidden my car keys. He had placed a massive, ticking financial bomb under my entire existence, fully prepared to sacrifice me the moment his criminal empire faced any danger. The final lines of Rachel's letter were a desperate, urgent plea. She instructed me to look at the small black digital drive included in the envelope. She wrote that it contained all the encrypted financial records, the surveillance photos, and the direct contact information for the federal agents she had been secretly working with. She begged me to take the evidence and protect myself before Colin realized she had successfully passed the information along. I sat back in my chair and let the pages fall onto the desk. The house around me remained completely silent, but a deafening roar of clarity echoed in my mind. The betrayal was so absolute, so profoundly evil, that it instantly burned away any remaining shred of paternal affection I held for my son. He viewed me as nothing more than a disposable asset to fund his greed. He thought I was just a weak, confused old man waiting to die in a cramped room. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope along with the digital drive. I stood up, feeling a new, terrifying strength flowing through my veins. The simmering conflict was officially over. The tragic explosion had passed. It was time for the silent adjustment. The bus ride back from the cemetery felt completely different than the ride there. The heavy sorrow in my chest had been entirely replaced by a cold, calculating fire. I kept my hand pressed firmly against the inside pocket of my winter coat, feeling the solid weight of the digital drive and the tragic letter. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as I walked down the familiar sidewalk, but my eyes were completely opened to the invisible poison seeping from my own home. As I approached my driveway, the sharp, pounding beat of loud electronic music vibrated through the soles of my shoes. I walked through the side gate and stepped into the backyard. The scene before me was a grotesque display of unearned wealth and complete moral decay. Colin and Megan were hosting a lavish pool party. It was the middle of the afternoon on the very day the woman next door was buried, and my son was treating his backyard like a luxury resort. The swimming pool I had built for my late wife was filled with floating inflatable chairs and empty beer cans. A massive catering spread of expensive meats and imported cheeses covered the patio tables. Around the pool lounged a dozen men and women I had never seen in daylight. They were the same people who drove the dark luxury cars into the garage at 3 a.m. Colin was standing near the deep end of the pool, holding a silver pair of grilling tongs like a scepter. He was wearing expensive designer swim trunks and a thick gold chain that caught the afternoon sun. He was loudly bragging to a group of men about the new concrete driveway he was going to pour next week, claiming he had brilliantly secured the extra land for nothing. Megan was reclining on a padded lounge chair, wearing a new silk cover-up, holding a brightly colored cocktail. She laughed shrilly at a joke one of the shady contractors made, completely oblivious to the massive federal crime funding her entire lifestyle. I stood at the edge of the patio in my dark wool suit, feeling entirely out of place. The loud music suddenly dipped as someone lowered the volume. Colin turned around and spotted me. A cruel, mocking smile spread across his face. He called out to the entire party, drawing everyone's attention to the old man in the black suit. He asked me loudly if I had fun playing in the dirt with the poor people. A chorus of forced laughter erupted from his criminal associates. It took every ounce of discipline I had ever learned in my 71 years to not walk forward and strike him across his arrogant face. Instead, I remembered the massive fraudulent mortgage and the terrifying truth hidden inside my coat pocket. I knew I needed absolute silence to build my trap, so I gave them exactly what they wanted to see. I let my shoulders slump heavily forward. I allowed my hands to shake just a little bit as I reached up to loosen my dark tie. I forced my eyes to lose their sharp focus, looking around the crowded patio with a vague, bewildered expression. I blinked slowly at the bright sunlight, acting perfectly, like a man whose mind was slowly slipping away into the fog of dementia. I took a slow, shuffling step forward and spoke in a weak, trembling voice. I told Colin that the bus ride was very long and I got turned around at the transit station. I mumbled softly that there were too many loud noises and I just wanted to find my room. The cruel laughter from his friends instantly died down, replaced by awkward, uncomfortable glances. Colin rolled his eyes dramatically, playing the role of the burdened son perfectly. He sighed loudly and told his guests not to mind me, claiming I simply forgot my medication and wandered off earlier in the day. Megan sat up on her lounge chair and gave me a look of pure, patronizing pity. She spoke to me in that slow, loud voice usually reserved for toddlers. She told me to go straight down the hall and take a nap, warning me not to touch any of the catering trays on my way inside. She told the guests that taking care of me was a constant, exhausting struggle, but they were doing their absolute best. I simply nodded my head, staring blankly at the stone patio, and shuffled slowly toward the sliding glass door. Every agonizing, slow step I took across that patio was a masterclass in deception. I let them believe I was a broken, confused old man. I let them feel completely secure in their absolute power over me. I finally slid the heavy glass door open and stepped into the cool air, conditioned quiet of the house. I walked down the long hallway toward my cramped guest room, keeping my posture stooped until I heard the patio door slide shut behind me. As soon as I crossed the threshold of my small room, I locked the door silently behind me. I stood up, perfectly straight. The fake trembling in my hands vanished instantly. I took off my heavy winter coat and carefully extracted the digital drive and the letter, placing them gently on my small wooden desk. The loud thumping bass from the pool party outside vibrated against my window, but the sound no longer bothered me. They were celebrating their wealth while standing directly over a massive trapdoor, and I was the only person holding the lever. I sat down at my desk, opened my old laptop, and prepared to examine the evidence that would send my own son to a federal penitentiary. The heavy bass from the pool party outside continued to rattle the thin glass of my guest room window. I sat down at my small wooden desk and opened my old laptop. It was a slow machine, but it was the only piece of technology I still fully controlled. I waited patiently for the screen to glow with a pale blue light. My hands were remarkably steady now. The initial shock from the cemetery had entirely faded, leaving only a cold, mechanical precision. I picked up the small black digital drive Rachel had hidden inside the sealed envelope. It felt incredibly heavy for such a tiny object. I carefully inserted it into the side port of the computer. A small window popped up on the screen displaying a single locked folder. Rachel had provided the password in her handwritten letter. I typed the sequence of numbers and letters with careful, deliberate keystrokes. The folder unlocked, revealing a meticulously organized digital archive. Rachel was a true professional. She had not simply gathered random pieces of evidence. She had built a comprehensive, airtight federal case against my son. I opened the first subfolder labeled Surveillance. A grid of high-definition photographs filled my screen. I clicked on the first image and leaned closer to the monitor. The picture was taken from a high angle, clearly from Rachel's second-story bedroom window, looking directly down into our driveway. It was dated 3 months ago, exactly 2 weeks before Colin decided to build the massive wooden fence. The image was crystal clear, capturing a heavy armored van parked with its rear doors wide open. 2 men were unloading heavy metal lockboxes and carrying them into my son's expanded garage. I clicked to the next photo. This one zoomed in on the face of one of the men. I recognized him instantly from the local news broadcasts. He was a known associate of a massive regional crime syndicate specializing in white-collar fraud and elder abuse. I continued clicking through the gallery. There were dozens of pictures documenting the nightly arrivals of luxury vehicles, the exchange of thick manila envelopes, and the unmistakable faces of corrupt local contractors. Rachel had documented a massive money laundering hub operating right under my roof. Colin was taking the life savings stolen from vulnerable senior citizens and washing the dirty money through his fake construction company. He was using the quiet respectability of my suburban neighborhood as a shield for a massive federal crime. The sheer scale of the operation made my blood run cold, but the next folder was far more devastating. It was labeled Financial Records. I opened it and found a series of scanned official documents. The very first file was a complete copy of the fraudulent $2.5 million commercial loan. I stared at the screen, analyzing the terrifying details. Colin had used my name, my social security number, and the deceptive financial management agreement to bypass the standard banking security checks. But he did not stop there. The next document was a fraudulent transfer of deed. Colin was actively preparing to completely remove my name from the title of the house I had built with my own hands. He had drawn up the paperwork to transfer the property into a blind corporate trust that he entirely controlled. He was planning to execute the transfer at the end of the month. Once that document was filed, I would have absolutely no legal right to live in my own home. He could legally evict me with 30 days' notice and leave me to die in a state-run facility while he kept the stolen equity. I looked closely at the signature line on the deed transfer. The forgery was an absolute masterpiece. It matched the slight tremor in my handwriting perfectly. My son had practiced stealing my identity over and over again until he perfected my ruin. I was so deeply absorbed in the horrifying digital evidence that I almost missed the sudden change in the atmosphere. The loud thumping music from the backyard abruptly stopped. A heavy silence fell over the house, followed immediately by the sharp sound of the sliding glass door opening and closing. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hardwood hallway, heading straight toward my room. I recognized the quick, aggressive pace instantly. It was Megan. She was coming to check on me. Panic flared hot and bright in my chest. If she walked in and saw the laptop screen, the entire plan would instantly disintegrate. She would scream for Colin and he would destroy the drive. They would likely accelerate my forced eviction to that very afternoon to protect their empire. I had less than 5 seconds to react. I quickly yanked the small black drive out of the computer port and shoved it deep into my pants pocket. I slammed the laptop shut, pushing it to the far corner of the desk. I dove onto the narrow guest bed, pulling the heavy quilt up to my chin. I closed my eyes tightly and forced my breathing to slow down into deep, rhythmic snores just as the brass doorknob began to turn. The door swung open, hitting the wall with a soft thud. I kept my eyes completely shut, letting my jaw fall slack. I could feel the sudden rush of warm air from the hallway and smell the strong scent of expensive sunscreen and alcohol radiating from her skin. Megan stood in the doorway for what felt like an absolute eternity. My heart was hammering so violently against my ribs, I was terrified she could hear it echoing in the quiet room. I maintained my slow, heavy breathing, perfectly mimicking a deeply exhausted old man, completely lost to the world. I heard her take a slow step into the room. Her expensive sandals slapped softly against the floorboards. She paused near the foot of my bed. I knew she was scanning the space, looking for anything out of place. She walked over to the small wooden desk. I heard the faint brush of her fingers against the cold plastic shell of my closed laptop. She was checking to see if it was warm to the touch. Thankfully, I had only turned it on for a few short minutes. A low, condescending scoff escaped her lips. She muttered under her breath, calling me a useless sleeping burden. She finally turned around and walked back toward the door. The latch clicked shut as she pulled the door firmly behind her. I waited a full 5 minutes, listening to her fading footsteps, before I dared to open my eyes. I lay there staring at the sterile white ceiling of my prison. The adrenaline slowly drained from my muscles, leaving behind a cold, hardened resolve. I slipped my hand into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around the small digital drive. The evidence was safe. The timeline was completely clear. Colin was planning to steal my home at the end of the month, but I was going to strike long before that. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I needed to leave the house without them knowing, and I needed to find Oliver Pierce. I slowly pushed the heavy quilt aside and swung my legs over the edge of the bed. I was no longer the confused victim they believed me to be. I was a man armed with the absolute truth, preparing to completely dismantle the empire of lies my son had built. The pool party continued outside, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was already crumbling. The morning after the pool party broke with a heavy gray sky. I lay awake in my narrow bed long before the sun came up, listening to the deep silence of the house. The loud music and drunken laughter from the backyard had faded hours ago, leaving behind a thick, suffocating stillness. I knew I had a very narrow window of opportunity. Colin usually slept until late morning, after his extravagant gatherings, and Megan had loudly announced the day before that she had booked a full day at a luxury spa downtown. I waited patiently, staring at the ceiling, until I heard the heavy master bedroom door open. Heavy footsteps padded down the hallway toward the kitchen. I heard the coffee maker beep and the soft thud of the garage door closing. Colin was heading out to inspect his new driveway expansion and meet with his shady contractors. A little while later, the front door clicked shut as Megan left for her appointment. The house was finally completely empty. I dressed quickly, putting on a simple pair of slacks and a quiet gray sweater. I reached under my mattress and retrieved the small black digital drive, wrapping it securely in a clean handkerchief before sliding it deep into my front pocket. I could not risk ordering a taxi directly to the house. If Colin checked the security cameras he had installed around the perimeter, he would see a cab pulling into the driveway and immediately grow suspicious. Instead, I slipped out through the back sliding door, keeping to the shadows of the dead garden. I walked the long way around the neighborhood, carefully avoiding the main roads, until I reached a small diner nearly 2 miles away. My legs ached from the unaccustomed exertion, but the burning adrenaline in my veins pushed me forward. I used the payphone inside the diner to call a local cab company, paying the driver with a small stash of emergency cash I had kept hidden inside an old pair of boots for over a year. The ride into the city took nearly 40 minutes. I watched the familiar suburban landscape give way to towering glass skyscrapers and busy crowded streets. The cab pulled up to a massive polished steel building in the heart of the financial district. I stepped out into the bustling morning crowds, feeling a sudden wave of intimidation. I was an old man from the suburbs, preparing to walk into a high-powered corporate law firm. But then I felt the solid weight of the digital drive against my leg. I remembered Rachel's empty funeral and the absolute cruelty in my son's eyes. I straightened my posture, pulled my shoulders back, and walked through the heavy revolving doors with absolute purpose. The receptionist on the 50th floor was a polite young woman sitting behind a massive marble desk. I told her my name and said I was there to see Oliver Pierce. She did not ask if I had an appointment. She simply nodded, picked up her phone, and murmured a few words. Less than a minute later, the heavy wooden double doors at the end of the hallway opened. Oliver Pierce stepped out wearing a dark navy suit and a grave expression. He walked straight toward me, extending his hand. His grip was firm and reassuring. He guided me into his private corner office, which offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the entire city skyline. But I did not care about the view. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the wrapped handkerchief, and placed the small black digital drive directly onto his pristine glass desk. Oliver sat down behind his computer and inserted the drive. For the next 30 minutes, the only sound in the massive office was the rapid clicking of his mouse and the soft hum of the ventilation system. I watched his face closely. He was a man trained to remain completely impassive, but as he opened folder after folder, a dark shadow passed over his features. He was reading the forged mortgage documents, the shell company and corporation papers, and the surveillance photographs Rachel had meticulously compiled. He leaned back in his leather chair and let out a long, slow breath. He looked at me with a mixture of deep respect and profound sadness. He told me that Rachel was a brilliant investigator, and the evidence she gathered was absolutely devastating. But then Oliver leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing as he opened a specific file containing the fraudulent deed transfer. He began typing rapidly, cross-referencing the documents on the drive with the live county property registry database. The silence in the room grew heavy and oppressive. When he finally looked away from the monitor, his expression was incredibly grim. He told me that my son was not planning to execute the deed transfer at the end of the month, as the original paperwork suggested. Colin had recently filed an expedited request with the county clerk's office. Oliver turned the monitor toward me, pointing to a red highlighted date on the screen. The property closing was scheduled for this coming Friday. That was exactly 48 hours away. My heart dropped into my stomach. I asked Oliver what that meant in practical terms. He explained the mechanics of the trap with terrifying clarity. In exactly 2 days, Colin was going to legally sell my home to a corporate entity called Apex Holdings. But Apex Holdings was not a real company. It was a ghost corporation entirely owned and controlled by Colin himself. By selling the house to his own shell company, he was effectively washing the property, making it look like a legitimate real estate transaction. Once the transfer was complete, the faceless corporation would instantly issue a formal eviction notice to the current resident. That resident was me. Oliver explained that Colin was planning to have me physically removed from the property by the local sheriff by the end of the weekend. I would be locked out of the house I built, placed on the street with absolutely nothing. But the most horrifying part was the massive $2.5 million debt. Because Colin forged my signature on the original commercial loan, that debt would remain permanently attached to my name. When the bank eventually realized the shell company was a fraud, They would not go after the corporate ghost. They would come directly after me. I would be forced into immediate catastrophic bankruptcy, ensuring I could never afford to hire a lawyer or fight back. I would be completely destroyed while Colin walked away with the stolen equity entirely untraceable. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I had thought I had weeks to prepare a counterattack. I suddenly realized I was standing on the very edge of a massive cliff and my son was already pushing my back. I looked at Oliver, my voice completely steady despite the terror gripping my chest. I asked him if there was anything we could do to stop it. Oliver did not hesitate. He closed the laptop and folded his hands on the desk. He told me that Rachel came to him specifically because he specialized in aggressive corporate litigation and asset recovery. She knew that simply handing this evidence to the local police would take months of bureaucratic delays, giving Colin plenty of time to flee the country with the laundered money. We needed to strike with overwhelming legal and financial force before the 48 hours expired. Oliver outlined the counter-move. Because the original power of attorney and the massive mortgage were based on verified forgery, we had the legal grounds to instantly freeze every single asset connected to my name. But we were not just going to stop the sale of the house. Oliver explained that he was going to set up a protected blind trust entirely under my control. We were going to legally sever the fraudulent loan from my identity and attach it directly back to Colin's personal shell company. Furthermore, Oliver revealed that he had already been in contact with the federal agents Rachel had been quietly working with. They were just waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to secure a federal warrant. The digital drive I brought them was that exact piece. We spent the next 4 hours drafting the most complex legal documents of my life. I signed affidavits, declarations of fraud, and the official paperwork to establish my new protective trust. Every time I signed my name, I felt a heavy chain falling away from my shoulders. We were building a financial guillotine, and my son was going to willingly put his own head inside it. As the sun began to set over the city, Oliver handed me a copy of the federal injunction. He told me to go back to the house and act exactly as I had been acting. He told me to let Colin believe his plan was working perfectly. When the time was right, we would bring his entire empire crashing down on top of him. I shook Oliver's hand, thanked him for his brilliant work, and walked out of the office. The fear was completely gone. I was walking back into the lion's den, but this time I was the one holding the leash. The mahogany doors of Oliver Pierce's office closed, and the room instantly transformed from a quiet meeting space into a legal war room. Oliver did not waste a single second. He summoned 2 of his senior paralegals and began dictating a series of emergency legal filings with terrifying speed and precision. The foundation of our entire counterattack rested on one undeniable fact. Colin had forged my signature to obtain the power of attorney. Because that foundational document was a verified criminal fraud, every single financial transaction, property transfer, and commercial loan executed under that authority was legally void. I watched as Oliver rapidly drew up the paperwork to establish a protected blind trust in my name. This trust would instantly absorb my home and my remaining legitimate retirement funds, wrapping them in an impenetrable layer of corporate legal armor. Once the trust was established, Oliver moved to the offensive. He filed an emergency ex parte injunction directly with the federal judge. This specific filing allowed us to instantly freeze all of Colin's personal and business assets without giving him any prior notification. We were cutting off his financial oxygen. Furthermore, Oliver drafted a formal notice of fraud to the commercial bank that had issued the massive loan. By legally severing the fake $2.5 million mortgage from my identity, the debt was forcefully rebounded directly onto Colin's shell company. He would be entirely personally liable for the massive sum he had stolen, and he would have absolutely no access to the frozen funds to pay it back. The legal trap was completely ironclad, but the financial ruin was only half of the justice Colin deserved. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, a private elevator at the end of the executive hallway chimed softly. 2 men wearing dark, unassuming suits stepped into Oliver's office. They introduced themselves as special agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. These were the exact agents Rachel had been quietly communicating with for months. They did not treat me like a confused old man. They treated me with profound respect, shaking my hand and expressing their deep sorrow over Rachel's sudden passing. They told me she was one of the bravest citizens they had ever worked with, and they were determined to finish the job she started. Oliver handed the agents the small black digital drive. They plugged it into a secure terminal and reviewed the surveillance photographs and the encrypted financial ledgers. I watched the grim satisfaction spread across their faces. The lead agent turned to me and stated that Rachel's evidence was the final missing puzzle piece they desperately needed. For months, they had suspected Colin was operating a massive money laundering hub, but they lacked the concrete internal documentation required to secure a judge's signature for a full federal raid. Now they had everything. They had the forged signatures, the wire transfer records, and clear photographs of known syndicate members moving stolen cash into my suburban garage. We spent the next 2 hours meticulously coordinating the timing of our strike. The federal agents wanted to move in when Colin and his associates were gathered in one place, ensuring they could seize the physical cash and arrest the primary contractors simultaneously. I provided them with the perfect opportunity. I informed the agents that Colin was hosting a massive catered event at the house the very next afternoon. He had invited all of his wealthy investors and shady contractors to officially celebrate the launch of his new real estate development firm, the very firm he planned to fund by stealing my house. The lead agent smiled a cold, hard smile. He said it was the perfect stage. The civil asset freeze and the federal criminal raid would be executed at the exact same moment, completely dismantling his empire in front of his entire network. Armed with a certified copy of the federal injunction, I left the towering glass building and took a cab back to the suburbs. The ride felt incredibly short. I was no longer a victim being driven toward his doom. I was the architect of my own salvation, carrying the instrument of my son's destruction. I asked the driver to drop me off 2 blocks away so Colin would not see the vehicle. I walked the rest of the way feeling a strange calm settling over my mind. The heavy wooden fence that had once symbolized my imprisonment now just looked like a temporary fragile structure waiting to be demolished. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet house. Colin and Megan were sitting in the living room, reviewing a stack of glossy catering menus for their big victory party. They barely looked up when I entered. I immediately dropped my shoulders and adopted my familiar slow, shuffling walk. I muttered something under my breath about being tired from my long walk around the neighborhood. Megan rolled her eyes and loudly told me to make sure I stayed in my room during the party tomorrow because they were hosting very important clients. Colin laughed and added that I should probably start packing my things into smaller boxes, casually hinting at his impending plan to secretly evict me by the end of the weekend. I did not react to his cruel taunt. I simply nodded my head obediently and shuffled down the hallway to my cold guest room. I closed the door quietly and sat on the edge of my narrow bed. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the folded federal injunction, tracing my fingers over the raised seal of the court. Colin thought he had brilliantly outsmarted a helpless old man and completely erased the brave woman next door. He thought he was 24 hours away from absolute untouchable wealth. He had absolutely no idea that his accounts were already locked. His massive debt was permanently attached to his own name, and federal agents were currently staging a tactical raid unit just a few miles away. I lay down on my bed and closed my eyes, listening to the quiet hum of the house. I slept more peacefully that night than I had in 2 entire years, knowing that when the sun rose, the long, terrible silence would finally be broken. The morning of the party brought a chaotic swarm of activity to my property. White delivery vans blocked the street, and a small army of catering staff invaded my kitchen. They carried massive silver trays of roasted meats and exotic fruits past the doorway of my cramped room. In the backyard, a large, pristine white tent had been erected over the patio, completely covering the dead patches of grass where my hydrangeas used to grow. Colin was officially launching his fake real estate development firm. He had spared absolutely no expense for this celebration, using the millions of dollars he had fraudulently borrowed against my name. I watched from my narrow window as the landscaping crew tore down the final remaining section of the 8-foot wooden fence next door. The raw dirt of Rachel's ruined garden lay completely exposed, waiting for the concrete mixers that Colin had scheduled for the following Monday. He was flaunting his stolen land and his stolen wealth in broad daylight. By 3 in the afternoon, the guests began to arrive. The quiet suburban street was quickly choked with high-end luxury sedans and sleek imported sports cars. These were not the decent, hard-working neighbors I had known for decades. These were the men I had seen in the surveillance photographs. They had traded their dark late-night clothing for sharp tailored suits and expensive silk ties, desperately trying to look like legitimate venture capitalists and wealthy property investors. Megan glided through the crowd wearing a stunning designer cocktail dress, holding a crystal flute of champagne. She laughed loudly at their crude jokes, playing the role of the perfect corporate hostess. The catering staff brought out massive ice sculptures shaped like towering skyscrapers, perfectly reflecting his delusions of grandeur. I could hear snippets of conversation from the men standing near the pool. They were discussing offshore bank accounts and the easiest ways to intimidate elderly clients into signing over their pension funds. It was a gathering of vultures celebrating their latest kill. Colin stood at the center of the patio, radiating pure, unadulterated arrogance. He slapped the men on the back and pointed grandly toward his massive fortified garage and the newly stolen property line. He was the undisputed king of his imaginary empire. I decided it was time to make my appearance. I did not wear my suit. I put on a faded brown cardigan and an old pair of loose trousers, perfectly dressing the part of the forgotten burden. I opened my bedroom door and slowly shuffled down the hallway, leaning heavily against the wall for support. The sheer volume of the party hit me as I stepped out onto the back patio. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cigars and roasted pork. A few of the men in sharp suits stopped their conversations to stare at me with thinly veiled disgust. I kept my head bowed and my eyes unfocused, acting completely overwhelmed by the noise and the crowd. I slowly made my way toward the edge of the patio, clutching a simple glass of tap water in my trembling hands. Suddenly, the loud electronic music faded away. Colin stepped up onto a small, elevated wooden platform near the deep end of the pool. He held a microphone in one hand and a fresh glass of champagne in the other. He tapped the microphone, demanding the attention of his criminal associates. The crowd quieted down, gathering around the edge of the pool to listen. Colin began his grand speech. He welcomed everyone to the official launch party of his new venture, proudly announcing the name of his shell company to the cheering crowd. He boasted about the massive capital they had recently secured, entirely omitting the fact that it was stolen from my life savings. He swept his arm toward the ruined yard next door, claiming it was just the first step in their aggressive expansion strategy. He spoke about vision and ruthlessness and the glorious future of their wealthy enterprise. Then his eyes scanned the crowd and locked directly onto me. A cruel, patronizing smile stretched across his face. He pointed his microphone in my direction, suddenly changing the tone of his voice to sound incredibly gentle and caring. He asked the crowd to give a round of applause to the man who made it all possible. He looked at his investors and spoke with rehearsed fake emotion. He told them that his poor father was standing right there on the edge of the patio. He sighed heavily into the microphone and said that my mind was completely gone these days, and I barely knew where I was half the time. He claimed that taking care of me was an incredibly difficult daily struggle for him and Megan. But he puffed out his chest and proudly declared that he would never put me in a state facility because family always takes care of family. A collective murmur of forced sympathy rippled through the crowd of thieves. A few of the women placed their hands over their hearts, looking at Colin as if he were a living saint. Megan stood near the stage, dabbing the corner of her eye with a cocktail napkin, playing the role of the exhausted but loving daughter-in-law. The sheer hypocrisy of the moment was so thick it was almost suffocating. He was actively planning to throw me onto the street in less than 2 days, leaving me completely bankrupt and homeless. and yet he was using my engineered frailty to boost his own ego in front of his criminal friends. I stood there, letting their pity wash over me. I did not break character. I offered a weak, confused smile and nodded my head slowly, raising my glass of tap water in a feeble toast. I let him bask in the applause. I let him feel the absolute peak of his power and influence. I knew that the higher he climbed, the more devastating the fall would be. I took a small sip of my water and looked at my watch. The time was drawing near. His victory speech was nothing but the final desperate breath of a dying empire. I lowered my head and waited for the real guests of honor to arrive. The applause for Colin's cruel joke slowly died down, leaving a thick cloud of artificial sympathy hanging over the patio. I stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching my glass of water. Colin turned his back to me, preparing to signal the catering staff to bring out the next course. He expected me to lower my head and shuffle back to my sterile room, but I did not turn around. I set my glass down on a nearby stone table. The heavy crystal made a sharp, definitive clink against the granite surface. I took a deep breath, feeling the crisp afternoon air fill my lungs completely. For 2 years I had hunched my shoulders, dragged my feet, and swallowed every bitter insult. In one fluid motion, I let the charade fall away. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back for the first time in months. I lifted my chin, feeling the satisfying pop of my vertebrae aligning. I was no longer the frail, confused victim they had meticulously designed. I stepped forward, walking with a steady, commanding stride directly toward the elevated wooden platform where my son stood. Colin saw my approach out of the corner of his eye. His confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second, quickly replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. He held his hand out, likely expecting me to ask for help, or perhaps embarrass myself with a senile, rambling apology. Megan stepped forward from the edge of the pool, her expensive heels clicking rapidly against the patio stones. She reached out to grab my arm, intending to forcefully guide me away from the center of attention. But I did not let her touch me. I turned my head and shot her a look so cold and sharply focused that she physically recoiled. Her hand dropped instantly to her side, her mouth falling slightly open in shock. I stepped up onto the wooden platform. I reached out and took the microphone directly from Colin's loose grip. He was too stunned by my sudden physical transformation to resist. I stood at the center of the stage and looked out over the crowd of thieves and manipulators. The low murmurs of the wealthy guests completely ceased. The silence on the patio became absolute, save for the gentle rustling of the white tent fabric in the afternoon breeze. I brought the microphone to my lips. When I spoke, my voice did not shake. It was not weak or raspy. It rang out across the backyard, deep and resonant, filled with a terrifying clarity that echoed heavily against the massive wooden wall next door. I told the crowd that I wanted to sincerely thank my son for gathering everyone here this afternoon. I said it was truly fitting that all of his primary investors and closest associates were present for the official launch of his new enterprise. I looked directly at Colin. His face had drained of all color. He was staring at me as if a vengeful ghost had just materialized on his stage. He recognized the tone of my voice immediately. It was the exact voice of the man who had raised him, the man who had built the very house he was standing in, the man he thought he had successfully buried alive. I spoke into the microphone again, keeping my eyes locked on his pale face. I told him that I completely agreed with his earlier statement. Family truly does take care of family. And as his father, I felt it was my absolute duty to ensure his new business received exactly what it deserved. I reached into the inner pocket of my faded brown cardigan. The crowd watched in breathless anticipation, unsure if this was part of a planned presentation or an elaborate, uncomfortable joke. I pulled out the thick, folded document Oliver Pierce had given me the day before. I slowly unfolded the thick white paper. The crisp sound of the heavy parchment was amplified by the microphone sounding incredibly sharp, like the cracking of a whip. I held the document up for the entire crowd to see. I announced with perfect enunciation that this was a federal injunction. I stated clearly that as of 1 hour ago, every single bank account, property deed, and financial asset tied to Colin's name and his new shell company had been completely and irrevocably frozen by order of a federal judge. The words hung in the air like a heavy dark cloud. Before anyone in the bewildered crowd could fully process the catastrophic meaning of my statement, a new sound violently interrupted the silence. It was the loud grinding screech of the heavy iron security gates at the front of the driveway being forcefully pushed open. The heavy thud of tactical boots marching in perfect synchronization echoed down the side path of the house. The catering staff near the edge of the patio nervously backed away, dropping their silver trays onto the grass. From around the corner of the brick house emerged Oliver Pierce. He was not wearing a tuxedo or a party suit. He wore his sharp charcoal litigation armor, his face set in a mask of absolute legal authority. Oliver did not walk alone. Flanking him on either side were 3 massive federal agents wearing dark tactical vests with the letters FBI printed in bright bold yellow across their chests. Their hands rested firmly on the heavy black belts at their waists. Following closely behind the federal agents were 2 local county sheriffs, their silver badges catching the afternoon sun. They moved with the swift, coordinated precision of a predator closing in on a trap. They marched directly onto the stone patio, their heavy boots crushing the delicate imported foods that had fallen from the catering trays. A sudden wave of raw panic violently swept through the crowd of investors. These were men who survived in the shadows, and they instantly recognized the overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement. Several of the men in expensive suits immediately dropped their champagne glasses. The crystal shattered against the stone, a sharp ringing sound that permanently signaled the end of the party. A few of the shady contractors instinctively turned toward the back fence, looking for a way to escape into the neighborhood, but the local sheriffs immediately fanned out. They loudly ordered everyone to remain exactly where they were, placing their hands on their holsters. The federal agents did not stop at the crowd. 2 of them marched straight past the swimming pool and headed directly for the massive steel doors of the illegal garage, completely securing the perimeter of the money laundering hub. The luxury backyard resort had instantly transformed into a locked-down federal crime scene. I stood on the stage holding the federal document, watching the empire crumble in real time. Colin took a stumbling step backward, his back hitting the railing of the elevated platform. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He looked at the armed agents, then at the frozen, panicked crowd of his wealthy accomplices, and finally up at me. The absolute terror in his eyes was profound. He finally realized that I had not been sleeping in the guest room for the past 2 years. I had been silently watching, calculating, and preparing for this exact moment. Oliver Pierce did not rush. He walked up the wooden steps of the elevated platform with the calm, measured pace of an executioner. He stopped right beside me and looked down at my son. Colin was trembling so violently that the microphone he had dropped rolled off the stage and hit the patio stones with a loud screech. Oliver reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents securely bound with a heavy blue clip. He pressed the thick papers directly against Colin's chest, forcing my son to instinctively grab them to keep them from falling. Oliver spoke in a voice that carried perfectly across the silent, frozen patio. He stated with absolute professional coldness that he was serving formal notice of a total civil asset freeze. Oliver explained precisely what that meant, so there could be no illusions. Every single bank account connected to Colin's name, his shell company, his secret offshore holdings, and even his joint checking accounts with Megan were now entirely inaccessible. Oliver looked out at the panicked crowd of investors and added a detail that sent a shockwave through the yard. He announced that the federal freeze included any recent wire transfers made to his so-called partners. A collective groan of absolute terror rose from the men in the expensive suits. They realized their dirty money was gone, trapped in a federal vault that they could never dispute without admitting to their own crimes. Colin stared at the papers in his hands, his eyes darting frantically over the dense legal text. He tried to speak to defend himself, but only a pathetic, raspy clicking sound escaped his dry throat. I stepped closer to my son, closing the distance between us until I was towering over him. I did not need the microphone anymore. The absolute silence of the trapped crowd ensured every word I spoke felt like a heavy physical blow. I told Colin that I knew exactly how he had funded this lavish party, his shiny new armored garage, and the imported sports car sitting in my driveway. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated panic as I slowly, clearly said the words, $2.5 million. I turned my head slightly to address the entire crowd of listening criminals. I wanted them to know exactly who they were dealing with. I explained that my son was not a brilliant real estate developer or a master negotiator. He was just a cowardly thief who forged his own father's signature on a commercial mortgage. I detailed how he had used the fake financial management agreement to bypass the bank security, pretending to the world that I was too senile to manage my own affairs. I told Colin that I had seen the loan documents, I had seen the masterful forgery of my name, and I had handed all of that digital evidence directly to the federal agents currently surrounding his house. Colin shook his head frantically, tears of pure fear welling in his eyes. He stammered, trying to formulate a lie in front of his peers. He held up his shaking hands, claiming it was just a temporary bridge loan, a simple misunderstanding, that he was always going to pay me back once the concrete was poured. I cut him off sharply. I told him that thieves do not pay back the people they are actively plotting to leave homeless. I pointed toward the massive brick house behind him, the property he thought he was going to legally steal in less than 48 hours. I smiled a cold, hollow smile. I told him he was looking at a fortress he could no longer breach. I announced clearly that I had already transferred the entire property, the deed, and all of my remaining legitimate retirement funds into a highly protected, irrevocable blind trust managed entirely by Oliver Pierce. I explained the beauty of the timing. The trust was legally established and registered with the county before the bank could ever finalize his fraudulent loan transfer. The house did not belong to me on paper anymore, and it certainly did not belong to his fake corporate entity. The shell company he had spent months building the vehicle he was going to use to legally evict me by the end of the weekend was completely empty. I watched the devastating realization wash over his face. The master plan to throw me out onto the street and claim my life savings was completely dead. He had spent a massive fortune tearing down fences and pouring concrete on land he would never legally own. The silence from his investors was deafening. They were looking at a man who had completely lied to them about his assets, his capital, and his absolute control. He was exposed as an incompetent fraud to the very people he was trying to impress. But the final blow was yet to come. I leaned in so close I could smell the stale, expensive champagne on his breath. I explained the fatal flaw in his arrogant plan, the trap he had willingly walked into. Because he had committed felony forgery to obtain the massive loan, the legal protection of his shell company was instantly dissolved. The corporate veil that protected his personal wealth was permanently pierced. I told him that the commercial bank had already been notified of the criminal fraud by my attorney. They were no longer holding a faceless corporation responsible for the missing funds. They were holding him personally liable for the entire $2.5 million, effective immediately. Every single cent of that massive, staggering debt belonged exclusively to him. He could not file for corporate bankruptcy to escape it. Colin physically collapsed. His knees buckled under the weight of his ruin, and he fell hard onto the wooden planks of the stage, clutching the freezing orders to his chest. He had absolutely no frozen assets left to pay the debt. He had no house to sell. He had nothing but an impending federal prison sentence and a multi-million-dollar financial anchor permanently chained to his ankle. Megan let out a piercing, horrified scream from the edge of the pool, finally understanding the math. She realized that her life of endless luxury, her designer clothes, and her spa days were completely over. She turned and tried to sprint toward the sliding glass door, hoping to grab her expensive jewelry from the master bedroom. A female sheriff immediately stepped into her path, placing a firm, unyielding hand on her shoulder and ordering her to stay exactly where she was. The dismantling was absolute. There were no loopholes left, no lies that could save them. I looked down at the pathetic, broken man weeping on the stage, and I felt absolutely no pity. The scales of justice had finally balanced, and the weight of his own sins had crushed him completely. The realization of absolute ruin finally broke the paralysis that had gripped the patio. Megan let out a scream that completely shattered the remaining silence. It was not a scream of sorrow for the victims they had defrauded, or a cry of concern for her husband. It was the high-pitched, piercing wail of a deeply materialistic woman who suddenly understood that her endless supply of stolen money had just evaporated. She looked down at her expensive designer dress and then looked frantically toward the sliding glass door of the house. Panic consumed her completely. She knew she had hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen cash and luxury jewelry hidden in the custom safe inside the master bedroom. She hiked up the skirt of her elegant dress and lunged toward the house, desperately trying to save the spoils of their crimes before the authorities could seize them. She did not make it past the edge of the patio. The two local county sheriffs moved with practiced speed. They stepped directly into her path, forming an impenetrable wall of law enforcement. Megan crashed into them, flailing her arms and screaming that she needed to go inside to get her personal belongings. She demanded they step aside, foolishly, trying to use the same arrogant tone she used with the catering staff. One of the sheriffs caught her wrists, easily subduing her frantic movements. He spoke to her in a firm, uncompromising voice. He informed her that no one was allowed inside the house. He told her that because the massive garage was attached to the main structure and funded by illicit wire transfers, the entire property was now officially classified as an active federal crime scene. Every piece of jewelry, every hidden stack of cash, and every expensive piece of furniture she had purchased with stolen retirement funds was now evidence. Megan collapsed to her knees on the stone patio, weeping uncontrollably as she watched federal agents string bright yellow crime scene tape across the sliding glass door of her former palace. Colin watched his wife break down, and the last remaining shred of his fabricated confidence completely dissolved. He was kneeling on the wooden stage, completely surrounded by federal agents and abandoned by his terrified investors. He looked up at me, his face slick with cold sweat and tears. The arrogant real estate developer was gone, replaced by a pathetic, desperate child who had finally been caught. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, ignoring the splinters of the wooden platform, until he was right at my feet. He reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the fabric of my loose trousers. He looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes and began to beg. He pleaded with me to make it all stop. He begged me to tell Oliver Pierce to withdraw the injunction and call off the federal agents. He frantically promised that he would sell the sports cars, cancel the driveway expansion, and give me back my bedroom. When I did not react to his empty promises, he resorted to his final, most manipulative tactic. He played the family card. Tears streamed down his face as he told me that he was my only son. He choked on his words, saying that we shared the same blood, that he was my legacy, and that a father could never send his own child to a federal penitentiary. He begged me to remember the good times, completely ignoring the fact that he had spent the last 2 years treating me like a disposable burden and actively plotting to leave me homeless and bankrupt. I looked down at the man groveling at my feet. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of paternal affection, any small spark of pity that might compel me to soften the blow. I found absolutely nothing. He had systematically destroyed my love for him, with every cruel word, every stolen dollar, and every shovel of dirt he took from Rachel's ruined garden. I looked at the federal agents who were waiting patiently for me to finish. Then I looked back down at Colin. I did not raise my voice. I did not show any anger or vindictive joy. I spoke with a voice as cold and hard as a granite tombstone. I told him that he built an 8-foot fence to hide his sins, but now he was going to live behind a much higher one. The words struck him with physical force. He let go of my trousers and slumped forward, pressing his forehead against the rough wooden planks of the stage. He let out a long, hollow sob of total defeat. He finally understood that there was no manipulation left to try, no lies left to tell, and no mercy left to exploit. The silent adjustment was complete, and the verdict was final. I stepped back and nodded to the lead federal agent. The agent stepped onto the platform and hauled Colin to his feet by the back of his expensive sweater. He forcefully spun my son around and pulled his arms tightly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around Colin's wrists echoed loudly across the backyard. It was the sound of absolute finality. The agent loudly read Colin his rights, his authoritative voice completely dominating the space. Colin did not fight back. He kept his head bowed, his shoulders shaking, as the agents marched him down the wooden steps and led him straight through the crowd of his silent, horrified investors. The men in the sharp suits watched in utter disbelief as their untouchable leader was paraded across the patio in disgrace. They knew that their own arrests were imminent, and the fear in their eyes was palpable. I stood on the empty stage and watched the agents escort my son out of the backyard and into the waiting federal vehicles parked on the street. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the neighborhood, but this time they were not signaling the tragic end of a good neighbor. They were signaling the absolute destruction of a monster. The empire of lies was completely demolished, leaving only the clean, hard truth in its wake. The heavy iron gates of my property remained wide open as the evening shadows stretched across the lawn. The flashing emergency lights had finally stopped painting the neighborhood in chaotic colors. Colin was gone, locked inside a federal transport vehicle miles away, but the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold on the patio. Megan was still kneeling on the stone tiles, her expensive designer dress completely ruined by spilled champagne and dirt. She looked around at the deserted yard, finally understanding that the massive party was over forever. The lead federal agent stepped toward her holding a clipboard. He did not offer any sympathy. He informed her in a flat, clinical tone that she had exactly 30 minutes to vacate the premises. He explained that because the property deed was securely locked in my protective trust, she had absolutely no legal right of residency. Furthermore, because her husband had used the house to run a massive federal money laundering operation, the authorities were freezing everything inside. Megan jumped to her feet, her face red with indignant rage. She demanded to be allowed into the master bedroom to collect her diamond jewelry, her designer handbags, and the large stack of emergency cash Colin kept in their hidden wall safe. The agent shook his head. He told her that every luxury item purchased during the duration of the fraud was now considered federal evidence and subject to asset forfeiture. He instructed a female deputy to escort Megan inside and monitor her closely. She was permitted to take exactly one standard suitcase containing only basic clothing and essential toiletries. Nothing more. I stood quietly near the sliding glass door and watched the painful procession. Megan stomped down the hallway, weeping bitterly as the deputy watched her every move. She tried to slip a heavy gold watch into her pocket, but the deputy immediately confiscated it. 10 minutes later, Megan emerged from the front door, pulling a single black nylon suitcase. She looked absolutely pathetic. She turned to me, her eyes filled with a toxic mixture of hatred and profound desperation. She asked me where she was supposed to go, complaining that she had no money and her credit cards were completely frozen. I looked at her with a steady, calm expression. I told her that she should probably find a cheap motel and start looking for a real job. She opened her mouth to scream an insult, but the deputy pointed sternly toward the street. Megan dragged her rolling suitcase down the long driveway, the plastic wheels clattering loudly against the concrete. She walked out into the dark suburban night, entirely stripped of the unearned wealth she had worshipped. While Megan was being escorted away, the federal agents turned their attention to the massive reinforced garage. They used heavy industrial bolt cutters to snap the thick steel padlocks Colin had installed. The heavy metal doors rolled up with a loud metallic screech, revealing the true heart of his criminal empire. Inside sat 3 magnificent luxury vehicles. There was a matte black sports car, a heavy armored SUV, and a pristine vintage convertible. They were monuments to his greed, purchased with the stolen life savings of vulnerable elderly people. The agents did not waste any time. Within an hour, 3 massive flatbed tow trucks backed slowly down my driveway. The heavy diesel engines rumbled, shaking the windows of the house. I watched from the front porch as thick steel chains were wrapped around the axles of the expensive cars. The winches whined loudly as the vehicles were dragged out of the garage and hoisted onto the flatbeds. It was a slow, methodical dismantling of Colin's false kingdom. The tow trucks eventually pulled away their heavy tires, grinding against the pavement, carrying away the last physical remnants of his arrogant pride. The federal agents finished cataloging the evidence inside the garage, sealed the steel doors shut, and wrapped the entire structure in thick yellow crime scene tape. They thanked me for my cooperation, handed me a copy of their official report, and finally drove away. For the first time in 2 entire years, the house was completely and utterly silent. I stood in the center of the living room listening to the profound quiet. There was no heavy thumping bass from the backyard. There were no arrogant voices echoing from the kitchen. There were no late-night luxury cars crunching on the gravel outside. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had crushed my chest for months was completely gone. I walked slowly down the hallway, passing the sterile guest room where I had been held prisoner. I walked straight into the master suite. The bed was unmade, and the expensive modern art Megan had hung on the walls looked cold and foolish. But the room was mine again. I opened the windows wide, letting the cool, crisp night air completely flush out the lingering smell of their expensive perfumes and stale cigars. I did not sleep that night. I did not want to miss a single second of my reclaimed freedom. I spent the dark hours walking from room to room, touching the walls I had built, feeling the solid hardwood floors beneath my feet. As the sky outside began to turn a soft, bruised purple, I walked into the kitchen. I bypassed the cheap instant coffee they usually forced me to drink. I reached into the high cabinet and pulled out a bag of premium dark roast coffee beans I had hidden away months ago. I ground the beans slowly, savoring the rich, earthy aroma that filled the room. I brewed a strong, hot cup of coffee, poured it into my favorite ceramic mug, and walked out through the sliding glass door onto the back patio. The backyard was a disaster area. The catering tents were half collapsed. The grass was trampled into mud, and the heavy wooden fence next door was completely torn apart. The raw dirt of Rachel's ruined garden looked like an open wound. But as I stood there sipping my bitter hot coffee, the first golden rays of the morning sun crested over the rooftops. The warm light washed over the broken landscape, illuminating the exact spot where the fence used to stand. The view of the neighborhood was completely open again. The barrier was gone. The toxic parasites were removed. I took a deep breath of the cool morning air, feeling a profound, deep-seated peace settling into my bones. The house was finally silent. The terrible war was over, and my life belonged entirely to me once again. The weeks following the raid brought a profound stillness to my life. The massive, fraudulent mortgage was entirely severed from my name and permanently attached to Colin's ruined shell company. The commercial bank formally apologized for their oversight and returned my legitimate retirement funds. Oliver Pierce ensured my protective trust remained completely impenetrable. I had won the war, but there was still one massive, ugly physical scar left on the battlefield. The towering 8-foot wooden fence still stood between my property and Rachel's empty house. It was a grotesque monument to my son's cruelty and a constant shadow blocking the morning sun. I refused to let it stand a single day longer. I did not hire a shady crew of midnight contractors looking for a quick cash payout. I hired a highly reputable local landscaping company and paid them generously up front using my fully restored savings. I sat on my back patio on a crisp Tuesday morning with a hot cup of coffee and watched the destruction begin. It was one of the most deeply satisfying sights of my entire life. The workers arrived with heavy sledgehammers and heavy-duty crowbars. They took swings at the thick wooden slats with practiced precision. With every loud crack and splintering crash, a piece of my former prison was dismantled. I watched as the dark, stained wood crashed to the ground, kicking up small clouds of dry dust. The foreman of the crew asked me if I wanted to salvage any of the lumber to build a smaller fence. I shook my head and told him to haul every single piece to the city dump. I wanted absolutely no trace of that barrier left on my property. As the final massive section of the fence was pulled down, a brilliant flood of morning sunlight rushed into my backyard for the first time in months. The light washed over my face and completely illuminated the dead patches of earth where my prize-winning hydrangeas used to grow. But more importantly, it completely opened the view to the property next door. The artificial boundary my son had built to hide his terrible sins was finally erased from the earth. I stood up from my patio chair and slowly walked across the freshly cut lawn. My heavy boots crunched against the remaining splinters of shattered wood. I stepped directly over the invisible property line that Colin had so arrogantly violated. I did not cross it with a bundle of surveyor stakes and a heart full of poisonous greed. I crossed it with a deep, overwhelming sense of reverence. Rachel's house stood quiet and completely empty in the morning light. The front curtains were tightly drawn, and the porch lacked the warm, welcoming glow it once possessed. The state had placed the property in a temporary holding trust while they finalized the complex legal matters regarding Lily. I walked to the side yard where Colin had ordered the rented backhoe to mercilessly tear up the earth. It was a massive, ugly wound of churned mud and crushed, delicate roots. Rachel had loved this small patch of land so much. She used to spend her quiet weekends out here kneeling in the dirt, carefully tending to her fragrant rose bushes and vibrant perennials. It was her small sanctuary away from the heavy numbers and federal investigations she dealt with at work. Colin had destroyed it all in a single afternoon, just to make room for his illegal delivery trucks to pour more concrete. Staring at the ruined earth, I knew exactly how I needed to honor the incredibly brave woman who had sacrificed her own peace to save my life. I drove my old sedan to the largest premium garden center in the county. I filled the trunk and the back seat with heavy bags of rich, organic topsoil wooden support stakes and dozens of mature, beautiful plants. I bought the most vibrant climbing roses I could find, delicate green ferns, and bright flowering bushes that perfectly matched the ones Rachel used to grow. I returned to the empty house and got down on my knees in the dirt. I did not care that my old joints ached or that the midday sun was beating down intensely on my back. I worked with a steady, rhythmic devotion. I spent 3 entire days restoring her ruined garden. I carefully dug out the heavy rocks and construction debris left behind by Colin's shady crew. I smoothed the fresh, dark topsoil over the brutalized earth, pressing the delicate roots of the new plants gently into the ground. I watered them meticulously until the soil was rich and fragrant with new life. I built a small, elegant wooden trellis for the climbing roses to grow upon, placing it exactly where her old one used to stand before the backhoe crushed it. I was not just planting simple flowers. I was burying the profound ugliness my son had brought into this world and cultivating a living, breathing tribute to a quiet hero. On the evening of the 3rd day, I stood back and wiped the heavy sweat and dirt from my forehead. The garden was completely transformed. It looked even more beautiful and lush than it had before the terrible nightmare began. The vibrant reds and purples stood out starkly against the quiet, empty siding of the house. I walked over to a small stone bench I had purchased and placed near the edge of the flower beds. I sat down and let out a long, slow breath. The air smelled of wet earth and fresh, sweet blooms. I looked toward my own house, no longer obscured by a towering wooden wall. The two properties flowed naturally into one another, sharing the exact same sunlight and the same peaceful evening breeze. I sat there as the sun slowly went down, whispering a quiet, sincere thank you into the cool wind, hoping that wherever Rachel was, she could see that her garden and the absolute truth she fought for were finally in full, beautiful bloom. 6 months passed before I saw my son again. The seasons had changed, washing away the heat of that terrible summer and bringing a cold, crisp winter to the city. I walked up the wide marble steps of the federal courthouse, my heavy wool coat buttoned tightly against the biting wind. The towering stone pillars of the building looked like the gates of an ancient fortress, designed to make every person who entered feel small and insignificant. It was a place where lies were stripped away, and absolute truth was measured in years and decades. I passed through the heavy security checkpoints, the metal detectors humming softly, and took the elevator up to the 8th floor. The hallway outside the courtroom was quiet, lined with polished wood and cold terrazzo floors. It was a stark contrast to the loud, chaotic patio where his criminal empire had finally collapsed. I was not there to gloat. I was there to close the final chapter of a book I never wanted to write. A few weeks before the trial date, the defense attorney of my son had contacted me. He was an expensive lawyer, likely paid for by the last remaining scraps of hidden money Megan could scrape together before the federal freeze became absolute. The lawyer had called my home speaking in a smooth, persuasive tone, asking if I would be willing to write a formal letter of character reference for my son. He suggested that a heartfelt plea from an elderly father might convince the judge to show leniency. He wanted me to talk about his difficult childhood, or his potential for rehabilitation, or any fabricated excuse that could shave a few years off his impending sentence. I listened to the lawyer speak for 5 solid minutes without interrupting. When he finally finished his pitch, I gave him a very simple answer. I told him that the man I raised died the moment he forged my signature to steal my home and endanger my life. I told the lawyer that writing a letter of leniency would be a profound insult to the brave woman next door who died trying to stop him, and an insult to the dozens of vulnerable elderly people he had ruthlessly defrauded. I hung up the phone and never spoke to the defense team again. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the gallery. The courtroom was vast and intimidating. I took a seat in the back row, resting my hands quietly in my lap. A few moments later, the side door opened and the bailiff brought him in. Colin was no longer the arrogant real estate developer wearing expensive designer clothing and thick gold chains. He was wearing a standard-issue tan prison uniform, his hands shackled in front of him. He looked terribly pale and thin, the artificial confidence entirely drained from his face. He shuffled toward the defense table, his head hanging low. He did not look back at the gallery. I wondered if he even knew I was there. Megan was nowhere to be seen. She had filed for divorce the very same week the federal asset forfeiture was finalized, quickly abandoning the sinking ship when the stolen money dried up. Colin was facing the absolute ultimate consequence of his actions completely alone. The federal judge entered the room and we all stood. She was a stern woman with a sharp, piercing gaze that seemed to see right through the expensive legal maneuvers of the defense attorney. For the next hour, I sat silently as the prosecuting attorneys laid out the full, devastating extent of the money laundering operation. They presented the forged documents, the shell company records, and the heartbreaking victim impact statements from the elderly citizens whose retirement funds had been entirely wiped out by his greed. The judge listened with a hardened expression. When it was finally time to read the verdict, the room fell into a suffocating silence. The judge looked directly down at my son. She did not mince her words. She called his actions a calculated predatory assault on the most vulnerable members of society. She noted his complete lack of remorse and his willingness to sacrifice his own father to protect his wealth. Because of the sheer magnitude of the financial crimes and the blatant forgery involved, she handed down a remarkably heavy federal sentence. 25 years in a maximum security penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of early parole. The heavy strike of the wooden gavel echoed through the silent courtroom. It was a sharp, definitive sound that signaled the absolute end of his life as a free man. The bailiffs stepped forward and placed their hands on his shoulders, guiding him away from the table. For a brief, fleeting second, as he turned toward the side door, his eyes met mine across the vast expanse of the room. There was no anger left in his gaze, only a profound, hollow emptiness. I looked back at him, my face completely unreadable. I did not offer a comforting nod, nor did I show a single ounce of vindictive triumph. I simply watched him disappear behind the heavy wooden door, swallowed entirely by the justice system. I walked out of the courthouse and stepped back into the freezing winter air. I thought I might feel a sudden rush of joy or a dramatic sense of victory, but the reality of justice is rarely joyful. What I felt was something much deeper and far more permanent. It was the clean, quiet peace of a restored balance. The toxic poison had been surgically removed from my life. The dangerous debt was gone, my home was secure, and the people he had hurt were finally avenged. I pulled my wool coat tighter around my shoulders and walked down the marble steps, breathing in the cold, clean air, ready to finally return to a home that was truly my own. I could not simply let the story end with my own personal vindication and financial security. While I was carefully rebuilding the garden next door and securing my peace of mind, a young girl was entirely lost in the cold, uncaring machinery of the state foster system. Lily was the innocent victim of my son's monstrous greed, and she was the living legacy of the brave woman who had saved my life. I called Oliver Pierce early one Tuesday morning and asked him a very simple question. I asked him what legal miracles he could perform to help a 71-year-old single man adopt a teenage girl. Oliver did not laugh at me. He did not tell me it was a foolish or impossible idea. He simply told me to come down to his office immediately so we could start the paperwork. We spent the next 3 months navigating a complex, frustrating labyrinth of family court hearings and strict social services evaluations. The state was initially very skeptical of my formal request. They looked at my advanced age and the highly publicized federal criminal case involving my immediate family as massive liabilities. The social workers visited my home numerous times armed with clipboards and difficult questions. But Oliver was an absolutely relentless advocate. He presented the family court judge with the full, unvarnished truth of our situation. He showed the court how Rachel and I had lived side by side for a decade in quiet, mutual respect. He presented photographs of the beautifully restored garden, bridging our properties. He proved that my financial trust was completely secure and that I could easily provide for her future. But the most important moment came when he arranged for Lily to speak directly to the judge in private chambers. She told the judge about the quiet old man next door, who was the only person in the entire world to show up at her mother's empty funeral. She told them she simply wanted to come home. The afternoon the judge finally signed the permanent legal guardianship papers was the brightest and most profound day of my entire life. I drove to the temporary state foster facility in my old, reliable sedan. I waited by the front entrance with a rapidly beating heart. Lily walked out through the heavy glass doors carrying the exact same faded canvas duffel bag she had held the morning they took her away. But this time she was not crying. Her head was not hanging down in defeat. When she saw me waiting by the car, a small, genuine smile broke across her face. I did not make a grand, emotional speech. I simply took her heavy bag, placed it carefully in the trunk, and told her we were finally going home. We drove back to the quiet suburban neighborhood in a comfortable silence. When I pulled the car into the driveway, she did not look at the massive brick house. She looked immediately toward the side yard. She saw that the monstrous 8-foot wooden wall was entirely gone. She saw the open green space and the beautiful climbing roses blooming brilliantly exactly where her mother had originally planted them. Tears silently rolled down her cheeks, but they were tears of profound relief. The transition into our new life was not magically easy or completely without pain. We were two deeply wounded people trying to build a new existence from the terrible wreckage left behind by others. There were very quiet days, and there were long evenings of profound grief for the wonderful mother she had lost so suddenly. But together, we found a steady healing rhythm. I gave Lily the massive master bedroom suite that my son and his wife had so arrogantly stolen from me. We spent an entire weekend painting the cold, sterile walls a soft, warm yellow and picking out bright new furniture. I stayed in my small, modest guest room, but it no longer felt like a dark, cramped prison. It felt like a cozy, safe harbor. We spent our evenings cooking simple, healthy meals together and sitting at the kitchen island while she worked on her high school homework. She brought a bright, youthful, vibrant energy back into the quiet, echoing halls of the house. It is a warm Sunday evening now, almost a full year since the terrible night the ambulances arrived next door. Lily and I are sitting together on the wide front porch of the house. I am holding a ceramic mug of warm herbal tea, and she is reading a thick paperback novel, with her feet propped casually up on the wooden railing. The neighborhood around us is completely peaceful. We can see all the way down the street because the ugly, oppressive fence is just a fading, bad memory. The view is completely open, and the late afternoon sun casts a long, beautiful golden glow over the manicured green lawns. The heavy silence that used to crush my chest has been entirely replaced by the gentle sounds of the suburban evening. I look at the young woman sitting next to me and I realize something incredibly profound. I spent my entire adult life believing that family was strictly defined by shared biology and a shared last name. I allowed my own flesh and blood to abuse me, to mock me, and to steal from me for years, simply because I felt biologically obligated to endure his cruelty. But the universe has a strange, beautiful way of correcting our greatest misunderstandings. True family is never an obligation of birth. It is a deliberate, conscious choice. It is built entirely on a solid foundation of mutual respect, unwavering truth, and a love that never seeks to exploit or destroy. Rachel taught me the ultimate value of incredible courage. Lily taught me that my old, tired heart still had plenty of room to grow. And my son taught me the hardest lesson of all, which is that some toxic branches must be completely severed so the rest of the tree can survive and flourish. I take a slow, warm sip of my tea and listen to the quiet rustling of the wind through the willow trees down the street. The heavy chains of the past are completely broken. The silent adjustment has run its full course. For the first time in my 71 years on this earth, I am finally truly free. The most profound lesson woven through James's journey is that true family is never defined simply by blood, but by unwavering respect, truth, and mutual care. We often feel obligated to endure toxic behavior from our relatives out of a misplaced sense of loyalty or societal expectation. However, James teaches us that protecting your own peace and dignity must always come first. Furthermore, his story proves that silence should never be mistaken for weakness. Sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is a quiet, calculated patience. True strength lies in recognizing when to sever destructive ties and having the courage to cultivate new chosen family roots built on genuine love. If you have ever had to bravely cut toxic ties to protect your peace, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more tales of resilience and justice.